Hey kids. So before we start on our next part of biochemistry, which is the proteins, we're going to take a look at back where we've been with all of this. Okay. So we started, and the first couple of videos were on our introduction. We learned the difference between inorganic compounds and organic. Primarily organics contain carbon and hydrogen. We learned about the elements involved, that's C, H, O, N, and P. Molecular formulas versus structural formulas. Molecular formulas like C6H12O6, but structural formulas show us the shape. And we also talked about isomers that have the same molecular form but different structural formulas. Then, biggie there is monomers and polymers. That is a constant recurring theme in this. Monomers, throw these beads out, one. Polymers, many. Okay. All organic compounds have that basic structure. They have building blocks that make bigger molecules, building blocks called monomers that make bigger molecules called polymers. Okay, and finally, dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis in that. Dehydration synthesis removed water to connect the monomers. Hydrolysis would add water to break polymers down back into their monomers. So then we did carbohydrates. The elements involved were C, H, and O. Their purpose was for immediate energy. That's the energy your body turns to first. The cell parts involved were chloroplasts and mitochondria. The monomers were the mono and disaccharides. The polymers were the polysaccharides. That makes sense. Then we got into lipids. Lipids are a little bit more confusing. The elements involved were still C, H, and O, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but much more carbon and hydrogen, very little oxygen. The purpose for lipids is long-term stored energy. Okay, that energy is going to be hard to burn off. Just ask anybody who has a few pounds of fat to kind of burn off. Okay, cell parts involved there are mostly your membranes are involved. Membranes make up for good barriers on cells as well as barriers and cell parts within the cell to keep water environments separate from one from the other. Okay, the monomers weren't really monomers, and remember I showed you like a big marker instead because the monomers, the fatty acids, are big, so we don't see them polymerize like monosaccharides did. Monosaccharides are little, and when they polymerize, they make a big long chain. But the fatty acids are already big, so they don't have to really polymerize. But there were a few polymers of lipids that we did talk about: triglycerides, phospholipids, and the sterols and waxes. Let me not forget the waxes. So now we're moving on to proteins, okay? And again, if you see the recurring theme, we always talk about the elements, their purpose, the cell parts, the monomer, and the polymer form. Same thing with this, same thing with proteins. Well, proteins go back to being easy, kind of like carbs. So let's start off our protein talk, okay? And we'll start off with the elements involved. We still have carbon, we still have hydrogen, we still have oxygen, but now the new kid on the block is nitrogen, okay? All proteins contain nitrogen as well. The purpose of proteins, now this is lengthy. Okay, if we actually ask what do proteins do in our body or in our cells, and remember, cells are like a miniature version of a bigger picture. So if we study what's going on inside cells, we can understand what's going on inside your bodies, okay? So what do proteins do in cells, or what do they do in our bodies? Well, I got like 8 purposes here. You ready? Okay, first and foremost is what you're probably familiar with. They're responsible for structural components. Structural components like your bones and your skin and your muscles and your nails and your hair. Let's just write a couple of those. Let's write muscles, muscle, bone, and hair. Okay, so those are some of the structural components. And also we'll see inside the cell, it has its own kind of like bones and muscles when we get down to cell parts that's made out of protein primarily. The second, and probably a more important function or purpose for proteins, is to be enzymes. And you might be like, enzymes, what are enzymes? Enzymes are something that speed up reactions, okay? Without enzymes in our body, every single metabolic process in our body would just go too slowly. We'd die before it would even finish. So enzymes are what we call catalysts, okay? Catalysts. See that word there, catalysts? Okay, made out of protein, right? But catalysts like speed up reactions. Speed up reactions. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about enzymes right at the end of this video, or if I do 2 videos at the end of the second part, okay? So structural enzymes. Number 3, storage. Some protein needs to be stored, and we can see storage like in the egg white of eggs. That's a good storage thing for a developing embryo inside an egg. We can also see storage of protein in seeds, a lot of protein and oils in seeds. That's why if you eat nuts, nuts are high in fat and high in protein. So they're pretty good for you, okay? And they come from plants. So remember, they're those unsaturated oils then that we just finished learning about. They're the ones that you want to eat more, okay? Another function of proteins is for transport. We're going to see where proteins are also in the cell membrane. We do have a lot of those phospholipids that make up the barrier, but then those phospholipids are like speckled with proteins, and those proteins are going to be responsible for really controlling what goes in and out of a cell, so for transport. Also along a cell membrane, the proteins can act as receptors. Think of them as little locks, like locks. And certain keys have to fit those locks if something wants to get inside a cell and elicit a response. So receptors are like the locks that objects have to like kind of be able to like open in order to do their thing. We also have like movement, or we'll call motor proteins. And these are the ones that definitely you see in muscle tissue. They're called actin and myosin are the 2 different proteins. You will notice also with proteins, you tend to see an ending of IN with proteins a lot of times. With carbohydrates, you saw OS. OS meant sugars and stuff like glucose and fructose and galactose. Lipids, there's just not a general category for them, so there's not a general ending for them. But proteins, you'll see an IN usually at the end of the technical names for proteins. So motor proteins, like those that make your muscles slide past one another to contract and relax when you flex a muscle and you extend a muscle, that's protein also. Number 7, hormones. Some proteins are used as hormones. A lot of your hormones are going to be sterols, okay, and that was in the lipids that we talked about, but there are a lot of hormones still, and 2 big hormones in your body are insulin, notice it ends in IN, and adrenaline. Notice that also ends in IN. Okay, those are 2 protein hormones. Insulin, very important for controlling your blood glucose level. And finally, the last function for proteins is for defense. This is very important right now as we talk about the COVID virus, because right now a lot of vaccinations are getting out there, and the vaccinations are made out of mRNA or RNA, and that RNA is teaching our bodies how to build antibodies. Antibodies are our defenders that are going to like lock up on a COVID virus should it come into our body and prevent it from attacking our cells. So defense, proteins such as antibodies. Now, antibodies have a technical name. I'm not sure what they're called, actually. I don't know if anybody even uses it, but they're made out of proteins, okay? And so here are our 8 functions or purposes for proteins in our body. These do not have like any more important role. Like if there was one that I was to say was the most important or the most abundant, definitely the most abundant, would be enzymes. So proteins that act as enzymes. But you might think structural is more abundant in the body, like muscles and bones and hair and skin and nails and all that stuff. But really enzymes are, if I had to rank one as the most important, I guess it would be that. All right, so now the cell parts involved. We're going to talk about two things. One, we're going to talk about the structural side inside a cell, the structural components. And then two, we're going to talk about the production line, of proteins. Okay, so first for the structural. When we think of structural, just like our bodies have like bones and muscles that give us like support in our body, so does a cell have what we call a cytoskeleton. And that cytoskeleton is made up of two things: microtubules, which are almost like the bones of a cell, and microfilaments, which are kind of like the muscles of a cell. So, if you considered your whole like structural support in your body, you would pretty much say your bones and muscles give you all the shape that you have out there. Well, in a cell, it's the microtubules and the microfilament that make up the cytoskeleton. Okay, now for the production line. I like to talk about this, and I often think, and it might go back to your childhood, if you remember a Drake and Josh episode where they were making sushi. And I always think of that one, but there's an old time show called I Love Lucy, where Lucy was in a candy production line. And I often think of that, and I'll tell you, and see if you can guess like kind of why. When we think of protein and the production line of protein, it all starts in the nucleus. In the nucleus is where you find the information, the info on how to build that protein. And that's in the form of DNA. Okay, so DNA inside the nucleus is going to provide the info. That DNA is made into RNA, and that RNA goes out to what we call ribosomes. Ribosomes are going to make the protein. Okay, ribosomes make the protein. Then once the protein's made, it needs to be transported, and that's what the ER, remember, the endoplasmic reticulum, it transports the protein. Okay, and then after the ER, it needs to be packaged up, and that's the Golgi apparatus, the Golgi. Okay, and that packages it, packages it up, and then finally it goes out to what we call a lysosome, and that lysosome is going to secrete the protein. Okay, so that's the production line. Why it makes me think of Josh and Drake and Josh, is because when they were in the sushi factory, they would get the information, and out of, from one side of the building would come like this protein, and it was on a conveyor belt, and that makes me think of the ER. And then Drake and Josh, were kind of like the Golgi apparatus, where they were packaging the sushi into something, and then they were sending it off to go, do its job, or, go have somebody eat it or something, So I always think of this production line. It reminds me of that. That's such a funny episode. You should YouTube that and look it up. But look up the old I Love Lucy one. Just type in I Love Lucy candy production line or something. And it's kind of funny. It's an old black and white show. But anyway, cell parts involved. For the cytoskeleton, again, we have the microtubules and the microfilaments. And for the production line, we have nucleus, ribosomes, ER, Golgi, and lysosomes. All right, so now we go to the monomer form of proteins, and it's called the amino acid. The amino acid is the monomer form. And here's an amino acid. You might be like, oh my gosh, Warner, what are you doing to us? Well, an amino acid has this central carbon atom. See that central carbon atom? And then think of it, remember how carbon has 4 bonds around it? Well, the 4 things around it include just hydrogen. Okay, just a hydrogen. This amino group, which is a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. This carboxyl group, which means acid. Okay, and then this side chain, which is kind of like X in math. This is what makes every amino acid different. So I'm going to show you a picture of a whole bunch of amino acids, but I'm going to end this video, and you're going to see that at the start of the next video, okay?